A deaf girl was abandoned at the station until a silent rancher took her to his cabin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty platform of Cedar Creek Station, but nobody noticed the small figure huddled against the weathered wooden bench. Nobody except the man who had been watching from the shadows for over an hour. What he saw would change everything he thought he knew about silence, survival, and the unexpected bonds that can form between two broken souls in the unforgiving landscape of 1870s Wyoming territory. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, her dark hair matted and her worn calico dress telling stories of hardship that most people her age had never faced. Her eyes held a peculiar alertness, constantly scanning her surroundings with an intensity that spoke of someone who had learned to read the world through senses most people took for granted. She clutched a small cloth bundle to her chest, her knuckles white with the grip of someone who had nothing left to lose. Thomas McKenna had seen enough abandoned souls in his 42 years to recognize another one when it crossed his path. The difference was, this time he couldn't just ride away and pretend he hadn't witnessed another tragedy unfolding in the harsh reality of frontier life. Something about the way she sat, perfectly still, yet completely aware, reminded him of the deer he often observed near his cabin. Creatures who had learned that survival meant being invisible while staying constantly vigilant. The station master, a portly man named Jeremiah Hutchins, emerged from his office with the irritated expression of someone who had been dealing with an unwanted problem for far too long. His heavy boots created small clouds of dust with each step as he approached the girl, his intentions clear from the aggressive set of his shoulders. Thomas watched as Hutchins began speaking to the girl, his mouth moving in what appeared to be increasingly agitated words. The girl's response was to look directly at his face, her head tilted slightly as if trying to understand something that wasn't quite reaching her. The realization hit Thomas like a physical blow. She wasn't ignoring the station master out of defiance or stubbornness. She couldn't hear him. The interaction continued for several more minutes, with Hutchins growing more frustrated and the girl becoming more withdrawn. Thomas observed the way she used her hands to communicate, small gestures that seemed to flow naturally, despite the obvious fact that Hutchins had no idea what she was trying to convey. Her movements were graceful and purposeful, a language all her own that spoke volumes about intelligence and determination. When Hutchins finally threw his hands up in exasperation and stormed back toward his office, muttering something about contacting the territorial authorities, Thomas knew he had reached a decision point that would define the kind of man he chose to be in this moment. The girl remained on the bench, her posture unchanged, but her eyes following Hutchins with the wariness of someone who had learned to anticipate rejection and abandonment. She seemed to sense that her time at the station was running out, and whatever fate awaited her next was unlikely to be kind. Thomas emerged from the shadows slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Years of working with spooked horses had taught him the value of patience and the importance of allowing frightened creatures to assess his intentions without feeling trapped. He approached at an angle, keeping his hands visible and his expression neutral. The girl noticed him immediately, her body tensing as she calculated whether this new presence represented another threat or simply another person who would ultimately walk away when faced with the complexity of her situation. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, gray and deep with an intelligence that had been forced to mature far too quickly. Thomas stopped about 10 feet away and did something that surprised them both. Instead of speaking, he raised his right hand and moved it in a simple gesture, forming letters in the air with patient, careful movements. He had learned basic sign language during his brief time working at a school for the deaf in Kansas City, before the call of open land and solitude had drawn him westward. The girl's eyes widened, not with fear, but with something far more precious, hope. She responded with her own hand movements, faster and more fluid than his clumsy attempts, but he caught enough to understand that she was asking if he truly knew the language of signs, or if he was simply mimicking what he thought she wanted to see. Thomas smiled for the first time in months and spelled out his response slowly, telling her that he knew some signs, but not many, and asking if she would be patient with his attempts to communicate. The transformation in her expression was immediate and profound. She sat up straighter, her entire demeanor shifting from resigned defeat to cautious optimism. The conversation that followed was halting and imperfect, conducted through a mixture of signs, gestures, and simple drawings scratched in the dirt with a stick. Thomas learned that her name was Eleanor, that she had been traveling west with her aunt and uncle, and that they had abandoned her at the station 3 days earlier when they decided she would be too much of a burden in their new life in California. Eleanor learned that Thomas lived alone on a ranch about 15 miles north of Cedar Creek, that he raised cattle and horses, and that his nearest neighbor was more than a day's ride away. She also learned, through careful observation rather than direct communication, that he was a man who chose his words carefully and seemed more comfortable with silence than most people she had encountered. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Thomas made an offer that would change both their lives forever. Through patient signing and gestures, he asked if Eleanor would consider coming to his ranch, not as a burden or an obligation, but as someone who might find value in the kind of life he had built, away from the judgment and expectations of towns and cities. Eleanor's response was immediate. She gathered her small bundle of possessions and stood, ready to follow this stranger who had shown her more kindness in one afternoon than she had experienced in the 3 days since her abandonment. Her trust was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a testament to the resilience that had kept her alive despite circumstances that would have broken many adults. The ride to Thomas's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful and unforgiving landscape in Wyoming territory. Rolling hills covered in prairie grass stretched endlessly toward mountains that seemed to touch the sky. Eleanor rode behind Thomas on his sturdy bay horse, her arms wrapped around his waist as they navigated paths that existed more in his memory than in any physical marking on the ground. Thomas found himself acutely aware of her presence, the way she leaned into the turns and adjusted her balance without any verbal cues from him. She was a natural rider, moving with the horse's rhythm as if she had been born to it. When they stopped to rest the horse and share water from his canteen, Eleanor demonstrated an ability to read the landscape that impressed even someone with Thomas's years of frontier experience. She pointed to cloud formations and used gestures to indicate that rain was coming, later proven correct when distant thunder began rolling across the plains. She identified animal tracks in the soft earth near a creek where they stopped to water the horse, her fingers tracing the shapes while her eyes questioned whether Thomas recognized the signs of elk and deer that had passed this way recently. As they continued their journey, Thomas began to understand that Eleanor's deafness had not diminished her connection to the natural world. It had intensified it. She noticed changes in air pressure, the subtle shift in animal behavior that preceded weather changes, and the nearly invisible signs that indicated water or shelter ahead. Her other senses had developed to a degree that made her almost supernaturally aware of her environment. The sun was setting behind the mountains when Thomas's cabin finally came into view. It was a modest structure, built from lodgepole pine, with a covered porch that faced east to catch the morning sun, and a stone chimney that promised warmth during the brutal Wyoming winters. The surrounding buildings included a barn, a corral for the horses, and a small bunkhouse that had remained empty since Thomas's last ranch hand had left the previous spring. Eleanor slid down from the horse and stood in the yard, turning slowly to take in every detail of what might become her new home. The silence that surrounded the ranch was different from the tense quiet of the train station. This was the peaceful silence of open spaces, broken only by the gentle lowing of cattle in distant pastures and the whisper of wind through the grass. Thomas watched her explore with her eyes, noting the way she observed the angles of the buildings, the placement of the well, and the clear sight lines in all directions. She was assessing the ranch not just as a place to live, but as a place that could be defended if necessary. Her survival instincts had been honed by experiences he could only imagine. He led her to the cabin and opened the door, stepping aside to let her enter first. The interior was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a simple wooden table and chairs in the center of the room. A ladder led to a loft area that served as Thomas's sleeping quarters, while a small bedroom on the ground floor had been intended for guests who had never materialized. Eleanor set her bundle on the table and began a more thorough exploration of her surroundings. She examined the construction of the cabin with the eye of someone who understood the importance of solid shelter. She tested the pump at the kitchen sink, investigated the contents of the pantry, and evaluated the security of the doors and windows with a thoroughness that spoke of hard-learned lessons about personal safety. Thomas found himself fascinated by her methodical approach to understanding her new environment. Most people would have focused on comfort or convenience. But Eleanor was clearly thinking in terms of functionality and security. She was a survivor, and her first priority was always ensuring that she could continue to survive. As darkness settled over the ranch, Thomas prepared a simple meal of bacon, beans, and cornbread. Eleanor insisted on helping, demonstrating kitchen skills that suggested she had been responsible for cooking long before most girls her age would be expected to contribute to household tasks. They worked together in companionable silence, communicating through gestures and shared understanding rather than words. The meal was eaten by lamplight, with both of them stealing glances at each other when they thought the other wasn't looking. Thomas found himself wondering what circumstances had led to Eleanor's abandonment, while Eleanor seemed to be trying to understand what motivated a man to live in such isolation by choice rather than necessity. After dinner, Thomas showed Eleanor to the small bedroom, using gestures to indicate that it would be hers for as long as she wanted to stay. He had prepared fresh bedding and left a pitcher of water and a basin for washing. Eleanor's gratitude was evident in her expression, but there was also a wariness that suggested she was still waiting for the conditions or expectations that would inevitably be attached to his kindness. Thomas retreated to the loft, leaving Eleanor to settle into her new surroundings. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch at night and thinking about how dramatically his life had changed in the space of a single day. The presence of another person in his cabin felt strange after months of solitude, but it wasn't the uncomfortable intrusion he had expected. Instead, it felt like a missing piece had been quietly put back into place. The next morning brought new challenges and discoveries. Eleanor woke before dawn, a habit that Thomas learned was born from years of being responsible for tasks that needed to be completed before others in her household began their day. She had already started a fire in the kitchen stove and had coffee brewing by the time Thomas climbed down from the loft. Their first full day together established patterns that would define their relationship for weeks to come. Eleanor threw herself into ranch work with an enthusiasm and competence that surprised Thomas. She seemed to understand instinctively that earning her place here required demonstrating her value as a working partner rather than simply accepting charity. She proved to be a natural with the animals, communicating with horses and cattle through touch and body language in ways that were often more effective than verbal commands. Thomas watched in amazement as she calmed a spooked mare simply by placing her hands on the animal's neck and maintaining a steady, reassuring presence. Her deafness, rather than being a hindrance, seemed to create a deeper connection with creatures that relied primarily on non-verbal communication. The days developed into a rhythm of shared labor and mutual respect. Eleanor took over most of the domestic tasks, not because Thomas expected it, but because she seemed to find satisfaction in creating order and comfort in their shared living space. She proved to be an excellent cook, transforming Thomas's simple ingredients into meals that were both nourishing and surprisingly varied. Thomas, in turn, began teaching Eleanor the more complex aspects of ranch management. She learned to read weather patterns, to identify signs of illness in cattle, and to perform basic veterinary care. Her intelligence and attention to detail made her an apt student, and Thomas found himself looking forward to their daily lessons as much as she did. Communication between them evolved rapidly from the basic sign language and gestures of their first meeting to a complex system of visual cues that was uniquely their own. Eleanor taught Thomas more formal signs, while he helped her understand the specific vocabulary of ranch work and frontier life. They developed shortcuts and personal variations that allowed them to communicate complex ideas with remarkable efficiency. More importantly, they learned to read each other's expressions and body language with an intimacy that went far beyond mere communication. Thomas could tell from the set of Eleanor's shoulders whether she was concerned about something, while Eleanor could interpret the subtle changes in Thomas's expression that indicated he was making important decisions about ranch operations. As autumn progressed into winter, their partnership deepened into something that neither of them had expected. Eleanor's presence had brought life back to the ranch in ways that had nothing to do with the additional labor she provided. Thomas found himself taking more care with his appearance, cooking more elaborate meals, and sharing stories of his past that he had never told another living soul. Eleanor, for her part, began to relax the hypervigilant stance that had characterized her first weeks at the ranch. She laughed more freely, expressing joy in simple pleasures like the warmth of the fire on cold mornings or the satisfaction of a job well done. The defensive walls she had built to protect herself from further abandonment began to lower, allowing Thomas to see glimpses of the vibrant, intelligent young woman she had been before life had taught her to expect the worst from everyone she encountered. The first major test of their relationship came with the onset of winter. Wyoming winters were legendary for their brutality, and Thomas had always faced them alone. The addition of Eleanor to his household meant additional responsibilities and concerns that he had never had to consider before. The storms that swept across the plains that winter were particularly severe, sometimes lasting for days and leaving drifts that made travel between the cabin and barn treacherous. Thomas and Eleanor developed emergency protocols that took advantage of her heightened visual awareness. She could detect changes in barometric pressure and wind patterns that gave them earlier warning of incoming storms than traditional methods would have provided. During one particularly fierce blizzard that lasted 3 days, they were forced to bring several animals into the barn to prevent them from freezing. Eleanor worked alongside Thomas in conditions that would have challenged experienced ranch hands, never complaining about the cold or the exhaustion that came from constant vigilance over the welfare of their livestock. It was during that storm that Thomas realized his feelings for Eleanor had evolved far beyond the protective sympathy that had motivated his initial offer of shelter. Watching her work tirelessly to save animals that belonged to him, seeing her face illuminated by lamplight as she monitored a sick calf through the night, he understood that she had become indispensable not just to the operation of his ranch, but to his concept of what home could be. Eleanor seemed to be experiencing a similar transformation. The grateful but guarded young woman who had arrived at his ranch in autumn had grown into a confident partner who anticipated his needs and contributed ideas that improved their shared life in countless small ways. She had begun to look at Thomas not as a benefactor who might withdraw his support at any moment, but as someone whose happiness and success were intrinsically connected to her own. The revelation of their changing feelings came not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through a moment of quiet understanding on a clear February morning when the worst of winter seemed to have passed. They were working together to repair fence posts that had been damaged by the weight of ice, a job that required precise coordination and mutual trust. Eleanor was holding a post steady while Thomas drove new nails when she looked up and caught him watching her with an expression that was unmistakably tender. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both recognizing that something fundamental had shifted between them. Eleanor reached out and touched his face gently, her fingers tracing the lines around his eyes that spoke of years of squinting into prairie sun and wind. Thomas covered her hand with his own, and they remained like that for several heartbeats, acknowledging without words that they had become something more than partners or friends. The love that had grown between them was built on a foundation of mutual respect, shared hardship, and the deep satisfaction that came from creating something meaningful together. Spring brought new challenges and new possibilities. Eleanor had been at the ranch for 8 months, and their life together had settled into patterns that felt permanent and right. Thomas began making subtle changes to the cabin and ranch buildings, improvements that assumed Eleanor's continued presence and reflected their shared vision of the future. Eleanor, meanwhile, had begun to express interest in the world beyond their ranch boundaries. Her confidence had grown to the point where she wanted to venture into Cedar Creek and interact with other people, testing her ability to navigate social situations without Thomas as an intermediary. The prospect terrified and excited her in equal measure. Their first trip to town together was an education for both of them. Eleanor had prepared carefully, practicing responses to situations she might encounter, and reviewing the signs Thomas had taught her for common interactions. Thomas had prepared by warning the people they were likely to encounter about Eleanor's deafness and asking them to be patient with alternative forms of communication. The response from the townspeople was mixed but generally positive. Some were curious and eager to learn basic signs, while others were uncomfortable with Eleanor's difference and preferred to conduct business through Thomas. Eleanor handled both reactions with grace and determination, proving to herself and to Thomas that she was capable of functioning independently in social situations when necessary. The trip to town also brought news that would test their relationship in unexpected ways. A letter was waiting for Thomas at the post office, sent by Eleanor's aunt in California. The woman had experienced a change of heart about abandoning Eleanor and was requesting information about her whereabouts and well-being. She was prepared to send money for Eleanor's travel expenses if the girl wanted to join them in their new life. Thomas read the letter aloud to Eleanor that evening, watching her face carefully as she processed this unexpected development. Eleanor's initial reaction was anger at being abandoned and then suddenly wanted again when it was convenient. But as they discussed the situation over several days, more complex emotions emerged. Eleanor realized that part of her was curious about what her life might have been like if she had continued west with her relatives. She also recognized that accepting Thomas's offer of shelter had been born partly from desperation and limited options. Now that she had gained confidence and skills, was staying at the ranch truly her choice, or simply the path of least resistance? Thomas, for his part, was forced to confront his own motivations and feelings. Had he offered Eleanor shelter out of genuine caring, or from loneliness and a need to feel useful? Was his love for her based on who she truly was, or on gratitude and circumstance? More importantly, was he prepared to let her go if she decided that her future lay elsewhere? The conversations they had during this period were among the most honest and difficult of their relationship. Eleanor expressed her fear that Thomas saw her as a charity case rather than an equal partner, while Thomas admitted his worry that Eleanor might stay out of obligation rather than genuine desire. Both of them struggled with the question of whether their feelings for each other would survive outside the isolated environment of the ranch. Eleanor ultimately decided that she needed to write to her aunt, not to accept the offer to join them in California, but to formally decline and explain that she had found a life and purpose that fulfilled her in ways that duty and family obligation never could. The letter she composed, with Thomas serving as scribe, was both a declaration of independence and a testament to the transformative power of being truly seen and valued by another person. Thomas's response to Eleanor's decision revealed the depth of his feelings and the maturity of his love. Rather than relief or possessive satisfaction, he expressed genuine admiration for the courage it took to make such a choice, and his commitment to ensuring that she never had reason to regret it. He proposed that they formalize their partnership not just as ranch collaborators, but as husband and wife, equal partners in all aspects of their shared life. Eleanor's acceptance of his proposal was given not from gratitude or limited options, but from the deep certainty that they had created something together that was worth protecting and nurturing for the rest of their lives. Their engagement was celebrated quietly, with a simple dinner and the exchange of promises that were more meaningful than any formal ceremony could have been. The wedding took place in Cedar Creek 6 months later, witnessed by the townspeople who had come to respect Eleanor's intelligence and strength, and Thomas's devotion to building a life based on mutual support rather than traditional expectations. Eleanor wore a dress she had sewn herself from fabric Thomas had ordered specially from Denver, and Thomas wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. The ceremony was conducted in both spoken English and sign language, making it accessible to Eleanor while also educating their witnesses about the beauty and complexity of visual communication. The vows they exchanged emphasized partnership, respect, and the commitment to continue growing together through whatever challenges life might bring. Their married life built naturally on the partnership they had already established, but with the added security of knowing that their commitment to each other was permanent and freely chosen. Eleanor continued to develop her skills as a rancher and began experimenting with breeding programs for their horses that would eventually make their ranch known throughout the territory. Thomas discovered that marriage to Eleanor brought out aspects of his personality that he had forgotten he possessed. Her presence encouraged him to be more social and engaged with their community, while her practical intelligence challenged him to think more creatively about ranch operations and business opportunities. As their first anniversary approached, Eleanor gave Thomas news that would add another dimension to their life together. She was expecting their first child. The pregnancy was healthy and uncomplicated, and Eleanor's practical approach to preparing for parenthood reflected her approach to every other challenge she had faced. They converted the small bunkhouse into a nursery and family room, creating spaces that would accommodate their growing family while maintaining the efficiency and functionality that had always characterized their home. Eleanor's heightened visual awareness, they discovered, would be an asset in caring for an infant, allowing her to detect subtle changes in behavior or appearance that might indicate illness or discomfort. Their daughter was born on a clear spring morning, with Eleanor's labor attended by the doctor from Cedar Creek and 2 experienced mothers from neighboring ranches. The baby was healthy and perfect, with Thomas's dark hair and Eleanor's storm-grey eyes. They named her Sarah, after Eleanor's grandmother, the only family member who had shown her consistent kindness during her childhood. Parenthood brought new challenges and revelations about the strength of their partnership. Eleanor proved to be an intuitive and dedicated mother, while Thomas discovered that his capacity for tenderness was far greater than he had ever imagined. They developed systems for nighttime care that took advantage of Eleanor's ability to sense the baby's needs through touch and movement rather than sound. Sarah grew up bilingual in spoken English and sign language, equally comfortable with both forms of communication. Her early development was enriched by the unique perspective her parents brought to understanding the world through multiple senses. Eleanor taught her to observe the subtle signs that revealed changes in weather, animal behavior, and human emotions, while Thomas shared his knowledge of the practical skills needed to thrive in frontier conditions. As Sarah grew from infant to toddler to young child, she became a bridge between her parents and the wider community in ways that neither Thomas nor Eleanor had anticipated. Her natural ability to translate between spoken and signed language made social interactions easier for the family, while her obvious intelligence and confidence challenged any lingering prejudices about Eleanor's capabilities as a mother and community member. The ranch prospered under Thomas and Eleanor's joint management, gaining a reputation for high-quality livestock and innovative breeding programs. Eleanor's visual acuity and attention to detail proved invaluable in selecting breeding stock and identifying health issues before they became serious problems. Thomas's experience and Eleanor's fresh perspective combined to create operation that was both traditional and forward-thinking. Their success brought them recognition beyond the immediate area, with visitors coming from as far away as Denver and Kansas City to see their methods and purchase their animals. Eleanor initially found these interactions challenging, but gradually developed confidence in dealing with strangers who were unfamiliar with sign language. She learned to use written communication effectively and discovered that many people were eager to learn basic signs when they understood the practical advantages. As their 10th wedding anniversary approached, Thomas and Eleanor reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought them from a chance meeting at a train station to a life that exceeded both their original expectations and their wildest dreams. Eleanor had grown from an abandoned, frightened girl into a confident woman whose intelligence and strength were recognized throughout their community. Thomas had evolved from a solitary man who preferred the company of animals to people into someone who understood that the right partnership could enhance rather than diminish individual capabilities. Together, they had created not just a successful ranch, but a model of how mutual respect and complementary strengths could build something greater than either could have achieved alone. Their story had become something of a legend in the area, told as an example of how love could overcome circumstances that seemed insurmountable, and how differences that appeared to be obstacles could actually become sources of strength. Young couples facing their own challenges were sometimes referred to Thomas and Eleanor as examples of how patience, understanding, and commitment could create lasting happiness. Eleanor's influence extended beyond her immediate family to the broader community, where she had become an advocate for other people with disabilities and a resource for families dealing with deafness or other communication challenges. She had established informal networks of support and information sharing that helped isolated families access resources and strategies for maximizing their potential. Thomas's reputation as a fair and innovative rancher had made him a respected voice in territorial politics and business development. His partnership with Eleanor had taught him to value different perspectives and to look for solutions that others might overlook. Their success had proven that unconventional approaches could be not just viable but superior to traditional methods. As they stood on their porch one evening, watching Sarah play in the yard while the sun set over the mountains that had witnessed their entire courtship and marriage, Thomas and Eleanor marveled at the unexpected paths that had led them to this moment. Eleanor's abandonment at Cedar Creek Station, which had seemed like the end of hope, had actually been the beginning of a life more fulfilling than either had imagined possible. Thomas's decision to approach a frightened, deaf girl had been motivated by simple human compassion, but it had led to discoveries about love, partnership, and personal growth that had transformed him from a lonely hermit into a man whose life was rich with purpose and connection. Their story continued to unfold, with Sarah representing the next chapter in a legacy of resilience, adaptation, and the power of two people who chose to see possibility where others saw only problems. The silent rancher and the deaf girl who had found each other in a moment of mutual need had created something that spoke louder than words ever could, a testament to the truth that real communication comes not from the ability to hear, but from the willingness to truly listen with every sense available and to respond with authentic understanding and unconditional love.